Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this week's episode, we look back and answer some of the excellent questions you have sent in recently and announce an exciting new addition to the Not So Quiet on the Western Front podcast. Well, hi Dan, it's time for one of our periodic listeners' questions episodes. And I know you enjoy these episodes as much as I do. They can be challenging because we don't really have that much pre-sight of these questions. There's not much time to prepare them. And they come in such a wide variety, so many interesting questions, so many interesting comments that we receive. I certainly love reading these comments. I love answering these questions as best I can. And in fact, as we said before, Dan, that one of the problems we have is we get so many comments and so many questions. And although we appreciate them all, we read them all, we can't answer them all individually. And in fact, the sheer quantity of questions that keep coming in and comments that keep coming in have inspired us to actually introduce a new platform where there might be an opportunity to interact with us a little bit more. Perhaps you could tell the listeners a bit about that.
I like that segue, by the way. Very nicely done. So, yeah, absolutely. That brings us, of course, to what is, I think, for us, and I hope for not just us, quite an exciting announcement, which is that we've been talking for quite a while now about what a great community we've got and trying to create somewhere where we've got if you like, a centralized location to go and find those comments, to speak to people. And I think importantly as well, for listeners to engage with other listeners, because the depth of knowledge we've got out there is just incredible. So what we've done is working with our technical guru, Linus, who's here behind the scenes with us. We've created, in effect, a new platform. And it's a little bit like, if you know it, Patreon, which is a way that you can support a podcast, except there are free elements here, including the kind of discussion forum that people can go and get involved in. So we'll go into some detail about it in short term. But the basics are, it's a great way for you guys to engage with each other, to engage directly with Spence and I if you'd like to share comments, to get ad-free podcasts, which I know for a lot of people is a really big deal, and just generally to support what we do because, of course, you know, these do take quite a lot of time and effort, and there's even some expense in creating podcast episodes. But at least in order to check out what it is we're doing, we're also offering a absolutely completely free month to come along, check it out, see if you like it. If you do, stay. If you don't, no worries at all. So there are plenty of options. We're also going to should add some exclusive content, which is going to be available, including the second half of this very podcast here today is going to be available directly on the Not So Quiet link. All of these links, by the way, are going to be in the podcast descriptions and the usual places you'd expect to find them. But more about that shortly, because we have got some great questions, Spence, and some comments, and I think a couple of points that we need to address where we may have missed a few bits out, and this is a good opportunity to do that. So let's dive straight into it because there's some really good ones. And I've got one here actually from Zach Ludwig, who has sent in a question, which is quite an interesting one. We've covered to an extent before, and he's talking about soldiers able to get sleep. How much sleep were they able to get when they were in the trenches? And it's an important one, not just for us, but most certainly for the men at the time.
It is. Sleep is perhaps the understated element in any kind of physical efficiency. And I know we often sacrifice our sleep in a way we'd never sacrifice our food, for example. In wartime, sleep's perhaps even more important, especially if you're in a technical role. You're a wireless operator, you're a machine gun operator, you're doing something that requires a high degree of cognitive ability. And so sleep is really important to soldiers. It's important for military efficiency. It's not just a case of getting your beauty sleep. This can mean the difference between military efficiency and inefficiency. And in terms of how soldiers could get sleep in the trenches, well, it varies a little bit depending on when in the war we're talking. We've mentioned a number of times about how awful the trenches are in 1914, especially for the Allies. Flooded, there isn't a dugout system. Sleeping in those trenches is incredibly difficult. In some cases, impossible. Men are going in literally 24 hours without sleep. Once the trench systems develop through 15, 16 and onwards, and you start to have trenches that are designed to be lived in, sleep becomes it becomes more formalized. So rather than just trying to fall asleep at night, unless you're on watch duty, instead there will be rotation in terms of sleep. Now, that does mean that some men will sleep in the day and some men might sleep at night. Also, soldiers who aren't doing anything actively and have a little bit of time to themselves, as we discussed in the 24 Hours in the Trench episode, they'll often try and just lean up against the trench, fall asleep, doze off as you can. I'm not sure the quality of sleep you're able to get there, but something that all armies strive to do when they're actually in trenches is to try and give their men as much sleep as they can. Now, that often means working in blocks of 4 hours. You might be lucky enough to have longer than that. It does vary throughout the war. It does vary by battlefront and what's going on there. But the armies, certainly from really mid to late 15 onwards, they do try and prioritize this. Now, there is, of course, a coda, if you will, to this, and this is if you're in a battle. One of the worst things that can actually happen to you in a trench, even if you're not being killed under a bombardment, a pre-battle bombardment, is it often robs you of your sleep. And we read about this from German accounts especially, where they're under very heavy artillery fire, be it British or French, for several days, for a week or so. And although the casualties might be light, because the Germans are well entrenched, they may have underground bunkers and so on, it's very difficult to sleep because the artillery doesn't stop firing during the night. And under those circumstances, you can have quite serious consequences. Psychological breakdown, in fact, from lack of sleep is a known problem for the Germans during these pre-battle bombardments. So sleep is precious, sleep is important. The armies do their best to try and promote it, but a lot of it depends on where you are. If you're in a very quiet sector, you probably get more sleep than you might get in your civilian life. You can doze off during the day. Nothing much is going to happen. If you're in a very active sector like Ypres or Verdun, sleep is precious and you're probably going to get it in a few hour blocks.
I should say, by the way, that's a really great question, actually, and it kind of lifts the lid on an area that I think we might overlook to perhaps a large extent. When we talk about, and we've spoken about a number of times before, this idea of trench rotation, and we talk about how men would need to be rotated in and out of the trench because it's wearing on the spirit and wearing on the senses and just very dangerous. Big chunk of that is it's also just impossible to get any decent rest. You're going to end up, if you're part of a 10-man section, you're going to end up on sentry go at daytime once every 3 hours, at nighttime once every two. So whilst you might get a few periods where you could sleep, you're never going to get any long sustained rest of any kind. And quite simply, guys just can't put up with that day in and day out. So being rotated out of the trench just to get enough rest to go back in again is a really big deal. So great question, and it's a high bar to start with. Let's move on to another one. I've got one here, Spence, I'm looking at right now, which I can feel you're going to really enjoy. But the trick is going to try and keep you under about half an hour to answer this one. So we've got Jackson Whitcamper, who sent in a message to us and just said, I would love to hear an episode that opines on the various cinema depictions of the First World War, stretching back to early films like All Quiet on the Western Front, Paths of Glory, Sergeant York, and to more modern ones like 1917, The Lost Battalion, Passchendaele, and or the new version of All Quiet on the Western Front. I'm going to offer you just to pick your favorite one and tell us a bit about that.
Oh, I'd love to do a full episode on this, but I fear, Danny, it would just be me raving about some of my favorite films. I absolutely love film, bit of a cinephile, and being able to talk about war films, especially how many there are, I think is a treat. It deserves its own episode. But I'm gonna pick three. I'm gonna limit myself to three, and two I think listeners you might have heard of. One you might not have heard of. So one of my favorites is Mons 1926. It's a silent film. It covers effectively the Great Retreat period from Mons down to the Marne. Black and white, silent. Created in the mid-20s when the mood about the First World War in Britain was quite different. So it's quite a heroic film. It's got a lot of action, a lot of excitement. It's all about the courage of the old contemptibles, the Army of 1914. It's actually brilliantly made. Quite expensive at the time. You've got lots of extras. You've got some very impressive actual battlefield sequences. You have the rare sight of a British general playing himself, because General Smith Dorrien is actually in this, and plays himself. He's a lot older than, of course, he was, or he appears a lot older than he was in 1914. But it's a great film that I think captures something about the 1914 campaign and also how people perceived it in the 1920s. And quite wonderfully, listeners, if you're interested in Mons 1926, you can actually see this on YouTube. where it's been uploaded with a new modern musical score under the name The Vanished Army. So if you search for The Vanished Army, you'll actually find a rescored version of Mons from 1926. Another one, and this is the one that listeners you might not have heard of. It's difficult to track down. You might need to go to a specialist website that offers obscure films. It's Suspense, which is a British 1930 war film. It's actually based on a play. And the idea of it is quite simple, and it's in some ways it's a one-shot style film. But the idea is a British unit moves forward and they take up a new position in a trench. And what they are initially unaware of, but gradually start to become aware of, is the Germans are tunneling underneath it. And the suspense, of course, is, are the Germans actually there? Is the unit cracking up? Is it under pressure? It's really a psychological film, although there's quite some spectacular explosions in it as well. It's a talkie, and it's completely underrated. It's a great film. It really holds up. Yes, of course, it's of its era, and you can see its origins as a stage play. But I think it's really great. Great movie, very tense, well worth a watch. And my final one, and this is it my favorite? I don't know, but it's one of my favorites, and that's the 1938 version of The Dawn Patrol, which is actually a remake of a film of the same title, and is based on a short story called The Flight Commander by John Saunders, who himself was actually really troubled by the fact he wanted to be a fighter pilot. He never got to be. But the 1938 Dawn Patrol, absolutely fantastic movie. Got Errol Flynn, Basil Rathbone, David Niven. I mean, what star power you've got. There are Royal Flying Corps fighter pilots. The actual aerial action is spectacular in the 1930s. Really well done. Some great innovative shots. In some ways, it's a version of Journey's End, but with fighter pilots. But it's just eminently watchable. And it actually has some quite deep themes about the cost, the psychological cost of being a fighter pilot, the cost of seeing your comrades fall. It's certainly got a subtle anti-war message, but it's also a story about courage and determination, and the action sequences are fantastic. So there's three: Mons, Suspense, and The Dawn Patrol. But Dan, what about you? You must have some favorites too.
Well, do you know, nothing like the knowledge and encyclopedic knowledge, I might add, that you have. So I'm not even going to attempt it. But what I will do, though, is just talk about that Mons film that you mentioned before, because it is something that I fairly recently watched, actually, I think probably on your recommendation, Spence. One of the things that fascinates me about it is, of course, when you talk about these early films and these early elements of film, you're not talking about guys who are acting the part. You're talking about guys who were there, and in many cases, literal veterans of Mons who have gone on to then take part in a film, Smith Dorrien being one, but of course many others, many of the survivors of the Old Contemptibles of 1914 actually feature in that film. And it's a remarkable, it kind of transcends being just a film for me, that when you realize that actually a lot of these guys that played it had been out in the trenches on the Western Front and had physically experienced that. So it's got something more powerful than just being a reproduction of something that happened 10 years before. So Mons, definitely free on YouTube. It's a winner for me. Go and check that one out if you've got a chance, listeners. Okay, so let's move on. Spence, why don't you pick one? See, is there anything that you fancy in this list of questions that we've got in front of us here?
Yes, I'd like to pick one out for you here, Dan. And this is from Peter Maas from Belgium. And he asked a question which I think forces us as British historians to reflect a little bit on historiography, which I always think is interesting. And Peter asks, do you think the fact that the UK has not been invaded since 1066 and that the British have never faced an occupation colours the way that the First World War is seen in the country by British historians? Does this lead to an inbuilt bias in how the war is perceived? And interesting question from Belgium, of course, which has a very different war, very different Second World War too. So what do you think, Dan? Do you think there is a danger of British historians being misled by this cultural legacy?
That's a good question. I add a caveat to that. I would say Britain hasn't been successfully invaded since 1066, not by a military force at least. So it's there have been, of course, fights on British shores, and there have been fights, of course, out to sea as well, which have involved Britain. But Britain typically, when fighting major wars, and it's a really good point, for the last several hundred years has been doing it on somebody else's soil. So I think there must be some element of bias here, or at least a lens that British historians look through that perhaps French, German, Belgian even Americans would not look through because, of course, when we talk about fighting in people's back gardens, it's not our back gardens. It's not our backyards that people are fighting through. It's not our towns and villages that have trenches dug through them and are absolutely shattered beyond belief. Being, I think, to kind of flip on its head slightly, being perhaps a Belgian, particularly from, say, the southwest corner of Belgium, where there has been war after war after war fought for the last couple of centuries, that inevitably is going to color the way people look at it. And maybe when we look at this with perhaps a slight detachment in that it happens somewhere else. There's maybe a little element of detachment to it. Whereas, if you're a Belgian that lived somewhere and, you can just walk down the road and say, well, this happened here. It's within view of my house that I walk past it. It's a street that I walk down every day. I think from that point of view, there must be some kind of, I couldn't tell you what, and I'd be interested to know what you think about this. Couldn't tell you exactly what that bias is, but I think there's got to be an impact somewhere.
Couple of points to bring out from this is one, I was just reminded as you were discussing this about 1940, when Britain probably faces its greatest risk of invasion since 1805. And there is a real concern in Britain that Nazi Germany will invade. And one thing that's observed is that the British public is not blasé about this risk, but has this almost unshakable confidence. In fact, there's a Second World War propaganda poster that's produced, which has the outline shades of a soldier from 1588, an English soldier, an outline shade of a soldier from 1805, and then the outline shade of a soldier from 1940, with the slogan, "We beat them before, we'll beat them again," referencing the invasion scare from the Spanish Armada in 1588 and the invasion scare from the French in 1805. So in the Second World War, you can definitely see British propaganda plugging into this idea, well, Britain has not been invaded for centuries. It's not going to be invaded. It's just not possible. You made a great point, Dan. Not successfully invaded. Important distinction. But I think one point about bias and so forth, and how we perceive the war in Britain and how British historians perceive the war, is it comes out particularly in the 1920s and 1930s about the idea, was this all a waste? Was it futile? Was it in vain? And so on. And we discussed this a little bit in previous episodes. Britain, in some ways, has that luxury to say this because Britain, although it's bombed from the air, it's besieged by U-boats, doesn't have German troops land on it, doesn't face German occupation at any point in the First World War. And so, although the wars are massive, colossal experience for the British nation, as time goes by, in some ways, the urgency of it declines and the necessity of fighting it declines. Whereas that's not quite the case in Belgium and France that have been invaded, that have been occupied, that in some cases have been brutalized. And sometimes I think the analysis that British historians offer sometimes is drawn into that. Not perhaps now so much in the 21st century, but if you read historians of the 60s and 70s, and there's some very fine historians there. I'm not criticizing their work. I'm just saying this was their perception. There's definitely an element of, if it didn't affect Britain, it didn't really matter in the First World War. Anglo-centric bias. And some of that's inevitable, limitations of language and so on. But I do think there's a different perception anchored on this. And the idea that the First World War is futile, as I say, I think that's a luxury the British can have that the French can't. And I think that's an interesting point to bear in mind.
I was just thinking as you were talking there that there's maybe a kind of visual description of this same issue that you can find by going to France or Belgium or Britain and comparing those three together. Because anyone that lives in the UK, for example, you could probably walk, I'd imagine in most cases, certainly with my own, you could walk within a mile of your home and very likely find a local village or town or city First World War memorial or war memorial that covers the casualties of both the First and the Second World War. And those list of young men that went away, fought, and quite simply never came home again is always a powerful reminder. Try doing that in France or Belgium. You get those same two lists, in many cases longer, but you get a third list with it as well. And that's the civilian casualties that are sustained in those fights. And quite often those lists are, depending where in France you are, as long or even longer than some of the casualty lists. So there's that third element that we need to bring into it. It's people losing loved ones, not only in the military in a far away and often hard to imagine location, but quite often in their own towns, own streets, and own homes. And that's a powerful thing that I think we shouldn't forget when we talk about this. The subject of loss, Spencer, generally has always been one that of course, we're drawn to, and I think for good reason. In fact, there's a comment here that I just want to bring up quickly. Liam T, who writes to us, he shared a comment, and I just want to get your thoughts on it in particular. So he writes and speaks about a relative of his who'd served in the Munsters in 1960 and then went on and was eventually killed while serving in a Labour battalion in 1918. And he was really interested in his comment about the idea of families being charged for inscriptions on their headstones. Quite a notorious thing, which has only really come to light in the last few decades. What we're talking about is having an epitaph put on a Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstone. Now, these are amazing little windows actually into an individual. And for me, it's something that stands out on British headstone amongst other nationalities because it does give you a little glimpse into the individual. But just how big a deal would it have been for people at home at the time, the idea of being charged to have an inscription on your loved one's headstone?
This is a really fascinating topic. I know we've touched on it before, but I want to, before we get your thoughts, Dan, just add a little bit of context to this. This is taking place at a time of great change in the British mindset, and by extension, of course, the what we call the Empire or the Commonwealth mindset as well, the English-speaking mindset. Because prior to the First World War, and I'm quoting here from a British officer, Arthur Osborne, who wrote a great book, a bitter book about his experience in the war called Unwilling Passenger. Difficult to track down now, but he reflected he could not understand why so many working class men joined the army because they were joining an army that promised them a lifetime or several years of backbreaking servitude and high risk of death to defend a country that has never given them anything and which they can expect nothing from. And in some ways, the pre-1914 world was like this. You still had workhouses where if you were too poor to keep a roof over your head, you'd go to a workhouse and you'd work in return for food. The very first dawnings of a welfare state had appeared. Old age pensions had been introduced, for example. Been some very small improvements to the lot of the working class, but in general, the working class could expect nothing from the government apart from law and order and some basic civil services. What had changed during the war is you have millions of young men and millions of young women, and in some cases, not so young men, not so young women, are contributing to the war, either through volunteering for the fighting or nursing services, serving in factories, serving in a multitude of roles. And they are committing themselves to the British nation state in a way that has never been seen before. And with that comes expectation. We've done our part as a social class, as individuals. We've sacrificed years of our lives. We've sacrificed our blood, sweat. We may have sacrificed loved ones. We want something in return. And of course, remember, listeners, that in 1918, the British have an election. And the slogan is there's going to be homes fit for heroes. The British government makes a clear statement that there will be a reward for this service. And then, with the epitaphs, suddenly there's the controversy about paying for them. And in some ways, if I'm being sympathetic to those who want it to be charged, these are people who are caught between the old and the new. These are people thinking in the pre-1914 world where the working class could expect nothing. And in general, didn't ask for much either, compared to the post-1918 world where now society expects something. They expect some sort of recognition and reward. And I don't mean this as an unearned reward. They want a better standard of life. And into this, you suddenly have this, well, you've got to pay for your epitaph. I can understand why people did this, but at the same time, it's very, very difficult to excuse. Just to put a little wrinkle onto this, there were actually some of those on the political left at the time who argued in favor of putting a cost bar onto this to discourage individual epitaphs, with the idea that there will be a clear distinction between families that could afford an epitaph and those who couldn't, and the majority of families would therefore choose one of the free epitaphs instead, and there'll be a unity in this. So you can see that there was wrinkles to this. But I have to say, looking back a century on, it seems almost unbelievable that the government was prepared to charge grieving families, bereaved families, this. What do you think about it, Dan? How do you react to this?
I think one of the things that we can immediately say about this is that the backtracking that comes a few years later suggests that certainly they didn't get the mood right, and you can understand that. I mean, you put yourself in the position of a mother who perhaps has a two or three sons go out to war, maybe one, maybe two, maybe all three don't come home. You're now faced with not only have you lost your loved ones, but you're now faced with shelling out from your own pocket to pay for a little message on their headstone. That does not sit well with certainly with any grieving families, and you can understand why. And those that can afford it, well, perhaps they don't feel the same. But it's this idea that you brought up, actually, I want to mention because there is maybe a slight caveat that you can throw to this because we need to think of it in a sense as well. There is a monetary cost to this. Not only is there a monetary cost in what people are charging, but there's also a cost, a physical cost for those guys to physically create these epitaphs. And we're talking a million plus of them in a time when Britain's pretty strapped for cash. They're thinking, well, maybe we can save on a pretty difficult situation that we find ourselves in. Obviously, it's pretty quickly realised that that's not the right mood. But something you said, Spence, this idea of a home fit for heroes, there's cost associated to that too. These are the heroes that didn't come home on the flip side of that coin. But what about looking after? What about if there is money to spend? If there is a spare few pounds and pence somewhere, is it going to look after the surviving veterans that come home who are also in dire need of support? Or is it going to go as a headstone on one of those lads that didn't have the chance to come home? The bottom line is Britain is not a rich state in 1918-19. In fact, it's in dire straits and will be for the next 20 years. So with some caveats, and I think I can convince myself that I don't actually believe what I'm saying here, there is perhaps a modicum of justification for some charging of headstones. The reality is, it is so wide of the tone and the mark and what all of these men fight for that the British government eventually backs up and says, "Well, hang on a minute, we're not going to charge anybody. Headstone epitaphs are going to be absolutely free." And I think that's the right choice. And I think history has served that is the right choice as well. But it doesn't make it uncontroversial. And even today, people really have a bee in their bonnet about this. And you can understand why it's an ongoing subject of conversation.
You can, and certainly now, I think looking back, the obstinacy with which the idea that you have to pay for epitaphs is pushed initially, and you made a great point, Dan, how quickly it backtracks once the tide of public opinion really reacts violently towards it. And bear in mind, listeners, too, this is now a public that has direct democracy in a way that it didn't before 1914. 1914, about somewhere in the region of 60% of adult males in Britain had the vote and no women. After the First World War, 100% of adult males have the vote and all adult women have the vote, albeit at a later age until the mid 1920s. So now the government really is answerable to the public. And when the public is angry, the government has to take notice in a way that it didn't prior to 1914. And I think this reflects what I was trying to get across, that it's changing attitude, this catalyst for change being the war. And I don't think now, looking at it a century on, we can find this in any way defensible, despite the fact, Dan, we've just spent 5 minutes trying to sort of put a little bit of context around this and things. I don't want listeners you to think this was special pleading. I think it was an appalling decision to say, oh, you've got to pay to put an epitaph on your loved one's headstone. And I would add a little positive to this. And this is the fact that because epitaphs become free, you don't have to have one if you don't want. One will be provided from a template. But I think one of the most touching and indeed rewarding experiences you can have in a Commonwealth War Grave cemetery is to read the epitaphs. Because here, the soldiers who are buried, the airmen, the servicemen, they suddenly stop being a name, rank, and number and a regiment, and you see a glimpse of their family. You see a glimpse of mom and dad, their brothers, their sisters, their children, maybe. And I find that incredibly powerful. And I know you do too, Dan. I know that when we've been on tour, the reactions that people have to reading the epitaphs is one of the most striking things, I think. And in that sense, it leaves an incredible historical and emotional legacy.
Yeah. And just as you were describing it, I was thinking of I wonder how many of you guys listening in were doing the same thing. Those that have been to cemeteries before, you're thinking of a few of those headstones, which always just stop you in your tracks. You can walk through a row upon row of cemetery graves, and then every now and then you just see one that just stops you, and you just say, "Wow." And the one that was immediately in my mind as you were describing that there was one to be found in Pozieres New British Cemetery, which is on the really in the heart of the Somme battlefield. And I always make a point to go there if I can. And a very simple headstone, very simple epitaph, and it just says, "Just a brave English boy who did his duty, so dearly missed by his mother." It's just so powerful, and it sums up so much for me. But we could talk about this forever, I'm sure. Let's go on, and I want to switch the tone a little bit, Spence, because quite often we talk about such nice comments that people kindly send in, and they say what a great job we're doing. How about things that we don't get right, or things that maybe we need to readdress? And I've got to, and I say it in all pleasantness, I should add. Craig Sisson messaged us recently, I think justifiably, asked why didn't we mention Canadian aces when we spoke about the Royal Air Force and the Royal Air Corps. He says Billy Bishop, the third highest behind Rene Fonck in total kills, Fonck having 75, he having 72 to Richthofen's 80. Bishop wasn't even mentioned. Much time spent on Richtofen with only 8 more kills than Bishop and 5 more than Fonck. Also, other Canadians, Raymond Collishaw with 60 kills, Don McLaren with 54, Billy Barker with 50. Spencer, why did we not discuss Canadian aces?
I think I would say, and with that, this is absolutely honest, Craig. Hand on heart, we didn't mention anywhere near enough about other nationalities' aces. Spent a long time in Richthofen, and the reason is I would love to revisit aces in a future episode, because the whole idea of a fighter ace, what you might call the public image of a fighter ace, and the reality of being a fighter ace, I think are absolutely fascinating topics. And when we were recording the Air Power episode, we were quite early in our podcasting career, so to speak, and we always tended to sort of go on a little bit more than we perhaps planned to, whereas that kind of episode now we probably do as a series. So in that sense, purely we run out of time. Perhaps we did focus too much on Richtofen, but he's such a fascinating character himself. But I think Billy Bishop, Rene Fonck, who's also a fascinating character, many of the other aces that we could have mentioned as well, British and indeed other German aces, I'd love to do them in a future episode. One thing to just sort of add about Billy Bishop is what an incredible fighter pilot he was. And he had some pretty spectacular adventures as well. And a fearless man, like many of the great aces, just got a natural, almost like a hunter's instinct, great shot. I think his skills was able to adapt very, very quickly in the air, which every single fighter pilot needed. He'd go on to be a chief instructor at the School of Aerial Gunnery, which speaks to his own ability. He got a tremendous eye for the flight of bullets, the sense about where to aim and so forth, how to lead a target and things like this. And he was a national hero in Canada, won the Victoria Cross, of course, and would also be a hero in Britain as well. And Britain, of course, keen, like every other nation, to promote its aces. Billy Bishop would become one of the most important. And he had a huge impact as well in setting up what would become the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan as well. So hugely influential figure. Love to revisit him and indeed the other aces in a future episode. Did we neglect them? Well, if we did, but I promise you it wasn't intentional. So there's plenty of other aces we can cover in the future. But we do appreciate, listeners, as Dan said, appreciate perhaps not the right word. We acknowledge that we do get things wrong. We make mistakes. Occasionally, you may feel that we are neglecting an element. Let us know. We'll do our best to try and rectify it in the future.
Excellent. I'm going to stay with the neglecting stuff and with the Commonwealth theme for this next comment as well. The excellently named Tasmanian Delight via Twitter, who I think contacted you, Spencer, says, I feel like you guys have a downer on Monash. We're talking Sir John Monash here, commander of the Australian Imperial Force by 1918. Do you think he was a great general?
Discuss. Do you know what, Dan? I'm going to throw that one straight at you because I've got some thoughts, but I'd be interested to see. Well, first of all, I'd say, before I throw to you, I'd say I absolutely would say I don't have a downer on Monash. And if we've neglected him, we haven't discussed him that much, that's purely accidental. But let's go to Dan. Do you think Monash was a great general?
It's actually a really tricky question. I'm not so happy you threw it back at me, but I'll give it a go. So it's, I suppose one of the things about this, and I say it knowing we've got a great and dedicated Australian audience, and rightly so, because Australia's history in the Great War is incredible and truly formative. What Monash achieves is in many ways spectacular. He is credited in many cases for the Battle of Le Hamel, for example, in June of 1918, of having really laid down the blueprint that ultimately ends with the start of the 100 Days Offensive and brings about an end of fighting on the Western Front. So all arms warfare, combined arms, very methodical planner, really careful of his troops, has a good eye for ground, has a good eye for timing as well, which is quite often overlooked aspect when it comes to generalship on the Western Front. He does some incredible stuff. I think that the only point that I would make that isn't even a negative, but I think does need to be borne in context. Monash is not just plucked out of thin air and happens to be, an absolute phoenix that comes up with ideas from scratch. Nobody's ever thought of this before. He's a product of his environment. And his environment has been in the school of hard knocks for a couple of years now. And he's learned from Brits, he's learned from other Australians, he's learned from the Ottomans, and he's learned from the Germans. And all of that experience combines into a man who is truly capable, truly conscientious of his troops as well, which makes him really beloved amongst men of the AIF. But he is a product of his environment. I would say he's a disciple of the famous Plumer. General Plumer, Plumer of Messines, really comes up with a lot of the ideas that Monash is going to take a step further. And Monash is fortunate enough to do it at a time when those resources are becoming available. So, is he a great general? I'm not sure. Is he a very, very good one? Absolutely. And is what he achieves pound for pound more impressive than the vast majority of his peers? Yes, I would say it is. So I don't have a downer on Monash either. I think he's a fantastic general. He's a product of his environment, but he's a human being. He's not superhuman.
I think a very fair summary. And I think Monash is a fascinating man and fascinating background and from Germano-Polish Jewish background, settling in Australia, some pre-war interaction with Australian militia forces, and then, of course, off to war. He's obviously a man with tremendous ability, detail-oriented. He's described as radiating this impression of force. He's a big man and he fills a room. Although he's not a rough or aggressive man in that sense, but he radiates authority. One thing I find really fascinating about Monash is he, unlike many of his contemporaries, Monash gets better the higher up the ranks he goes. And in some ways, that's, I think, because he gets more and more freedom of action. And he has more ability to set the tempo of battle as he wants and to implement his ideals rather than being a cog in a very, very big machine where his individual influence is limited to a few thousand men. And so he gets better at the higher he rises in rank, which is unusual in military history. Quite often we see the Peter principle. People reach their level of competence, and then if they go beyond that, serious problems start to follow. And Monash clearly is a very, very good commander. He's commanding at a time in the war when there's an opportunity to be that type of commander too. If Monash had been in charge of a corps in 1915, I don't think he'd have had the opportunities that he has in 1918. By 1918, the war has changed, it's become more mobile, and although he has inexperienced troops under his command, not least some American troops, he's got a very battle-hardened force, a well-equipped force. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean automatic victory. You've got to wield all these weapons effectively. And one thing Monash does is he wields all his elements extremely well. He's a great advocate of combined arms. And combined arms is one of those things that even today, soldiers go, well, obviously the key to victory is combined arms. Everybody knows that. Actually making it work against an active, determined opponent is very difficult. And Monash ultimately can do this. He achieves this. In that sense, he's extremely good. And just to sort of add a little bit more to this, a man who certainly regarded himself as a great general, and discussed that perhaps on our sister podcast, Both Sides of the Wire, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, in his short book, A Concise History of Warfare, he actually named Monash as the best general on the Western Front in Europe. And Montgomery, not one for giving credit to anybody except Bernard Montgomery, a man with a sizable ego, to say the very least. The very fact he picked out Monash, partially that's Montgomery's contrarianism as well, but I genuinely think he picked him because he believed it. Montgomery generally said what he believed, and I think that captures something. So, do we have a downer on Monash? Absolutely not. And if we've skimmed over Hamel, which we do cover in our Anzac episode, well, that probably just means it's another battle we can revisit at a future time, I think, Dan.
Yeah, very well said. And of course, lots more generals to cover as well. I'd really like to get stuck in some of the other General Curry of the Canadians and various others as we continue on this mammoth journey that is not so quiet on the Western Front. And it's set to continue. And I hope if you've made it this many episodes through the series, I hope you'll indulge us for just a couple of minutes as we talk about something that's quite exciting in terms of the future of the podcast now. Because as we said at the start of this episode, we do have a brand new offering. And that's going to be one, hopefully something that's going to help us sustain this podcast going forward. Secondly, offer some real added value and interest and engagement for you guys. So quite simply what we've done is we've worked alongside our technical guys and we've created a brand new platform. That platform is going to be, if you like, a Patreon style platform. So somewhere where you can go and pledge a little bit of support. There's also a free option as well if you want to come along and just engage in conversations on our community hub. By all means, come along and do that. There's also various different tiers of options. If you want to come along and join us, for example, if getting ad-free podcasts is important to you, being able to pick which episodes Spencer and I cover in future podcast episodes, even get a shout out on episodes like this, a direct shout out of your name and thanks for your support, and have access to free exclusive content like the second part of this Q&A that we're going to do right now. The option is there. You can go along and join us on the not so quiet new community platform, the links of which are in the description. And as a thank you to you guys and a chance for you to check it out and see whether you like it, because it's really, these things aren't for everybody, Spence. A chance for people to find out if they like it. What we're going to do is offer 1 month completely free for anybody that wants to come in. You can join at the tier of captain and you're going to have the opportunity to experience, from that rank at least, full Q&A episodes, pick a topic polls and ad-free podcast listening. So you don't have to listen to some of those annoying ads that we put in from time to time to pay the bills. But it gives you an option to come along and join us. Please do if you get a chance. We've got the second part of this Q&A session, which we're going to do just now. And we're going to address some of the things like the incredible response we've had to the trench lingo episode and some of the suggestions we've had from you viewers. But if you do have a chance, and this is an important one, Spence, to us in terms of continuing the podcast, a couple of dollars, couple of pounds every week, every month, whatever it might be. It's a tiny little amount, the same amount as a cup of coffee. It actually makes a difference between us being able to continue to thrive doing this podcast and having to make changes and adaptations. I, for one, love what we do and I just want to keep doing it. And your support is absolutely crucial to that.
I couldn't agree more. And two things just to add to that, just to emphasize. One is, I've said many times on this podcast, said at the start of this podcast, we love reading the comments. We love reading the emails, even if you do sometimes take us to task for errors and so forth. Long-time listeners, you'll know my woes over the Ross rifle and so forth, or my woes over French pronunciation. But I think that interaction is really the lifeblood of this. Otherwise, we're just really talking to ourselves. With your community, we feel like we are sharing with other experts, other people who are interested from around the world. And what this new platform does is gives us much more of an opportunity as hosts to actually interact back with you. And in the very early days of the podcast, I used to try and reply to all our emails, but that would become a full-time job if we did it. Whereas now here, we've got much better opportunity to do that. So do consider joining. We love doing what we're doing. We hope you love it too. And we hope that we get to share it with you for the future to come.
Great. And we will have, if you just scroll down to the bottom of the page right now, you're going to have the links to the brand new community, to our brand new communications hub, the Dugout, which we're going to coin right now on this podcast, where you guys can engage with us. And also there is a link right there with a promotional code that's going to give you 100% off, completely free for the next month, so that you can explore it and see what you like. And if you don't like it, no worries. Podcast content will always be free here or wherever you get your podcast, whether it's on Spotify, Apple, wherever it might be. You can always continue to enjoy absolutely for free the podcast right here. So that brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks ever so much, Anne, for the indulgement at the end there, because it's not always great to have to talk about all the administrative stuff, but it really is important to us. So thank you very much for that. And for the rest of you guys, we'll see you next time. And if you want to come and join us and find out part 2 of this Q&A session, do so right now over on our new platform. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.